Hi, my name is Dan Lasota, and I'm one of the instructional designers here at UAF eLearning and Distance Education. Every semester we host 4 Teach Tip live seminars. We begin this spring with a talk on flow states, tomatoes, and personal productivity given by Chris Lott, our design team manager. For those of you viewing the stream live, there's a facility for you to post questions. I'm going to switch briefly to show you a screen. And if you're looking at the live stream, there's a little button. I've circled it in red for you. If you click on that Q&A, there'll be an interface for you to post questions, and the participants here in our chat will be able to see what you're asking, and we'll answer you as best we can. So feel free to ask us all of your questions. And now we're going to head over to Chris.
All right, well, greetings to my mostly disembodied audience, and an especially warm greeting, I guess, to the future people viewing this in the year 3000. I hope it's really awesome there. You may or may not have seen a teaching tip go out if you're UAF faculty about Pomodoro and a technique for productivity that way, but I wanted to share that and a few other items besides. Hopefully there'll be something new for all of you. As Dan said, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A app there, and they will get relayed to me, or I will see them somehow. So I'm not going to sit here for a long time and let you watch my talking head. I'm going to switch over to some slides for a brief time, and I plan about 15 or 20 minutes, and then a Q&A session, and we will see what happens. So let's test the app sharing here. And this information is on the page as well. You got to the session presumably, so you will be able to contact me or find the session again should you want to. But I wanted to talk about 3 things primarily today, and that is 3 underlying principles of productivity. And I think productivity is a topic that is often ignored. It's left to kind of soft skills classes for students who are thought to be at risk, and people don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to their own productivity techniques. So it will be the first of some other teaching tips and sessions that I will be sharing information about how productivity systems work and simple ways to help improve your own, and hopefully for your students as well. And so I want to talk about 3 things, but I'm going to focus on the third one most. But to begin, every productivity system there is, every system for getting things done has some kind of trusted collection system. And all of this is going to be tailored to your needs, but you need some place to capture information. And that can be something like, this is my browser start page, a screenshot of my browser start page, where I can click this little pencil icon that you see there and edit and make notes and dump information right there. So that's my brain dump. You might use Evernote, you might use a paper notebook. There are various mobile apps for note taking. Whatever the case might be, the fundamental piece of any system that will help you become more productive with the time that you have is going to have some place to put things. Now I say some place, it might be some places, because you might have a paper notebook and you might have something online, but you need to be careful not to get spread too thin and try every new system that comes in to view that looks interesting, because pretty soon you have 18 places to collect things. You need a collection for the collectors, and that becomes insanity before too long. So whatever is simple and whatever works for you. I highly recommend Evernote if you don't have something in place right now, or a paper notebook. So number 1, trusted collection system. Get something in place for that. The second thing that you need is something for task and time management. I should say task and or time management, because it's quite possible that you don't need one of those 2 aspects depending on how you work. What I have showing here is Trello, which is linked on the resources page for this, or at Trello.com. It's a free application for task management, and you can see it's a very simple bulletin board style interface. And it's free, and it's useful. You might use Google Calendar. You might use any of the applications I was just mentioning that you use to keep your collection system in. You could use Evernote as your task and time management system. It just depends on how you work. So you need to have those 2 things in place before we can get to any of the interesting stuff with productivity, which has to do with focus and flow and how you actually use that time. So for focus, now we're getting into the area of soft skills for productivity that I feel are vital for students and for educators and pretty much anyone, but are unfortunately ignored. And really this should be part of any curriculum. And focus is going to take a couple of different strands. I'm going to use a couple of different approaches to talk about it. The first was the subject of the recent teaching tip on which this is based, which is the Pomodoro technique. Pomodoro is Italian for tomato. The person who invented Pomodoro, I think his name was Francisco Cirillo or something like that, invented it in the early 80s. And he based it around this tomato-shaped kitchen timer. So that's that kitchen timer that you see on the screen there. If you want to pay, 100% premium, you can buy that actual kitchen timer that says Pomodoro technique on it, but that's not the important thing. The important thing about the Pomodoro technique is that it is based on work sprints. And it's based on an alternation of working and relaxation. And the typical model is what's outlined here, which is when you know what task you want to work on and you're in the environment in which to work, you set a timer for 25 minutes, you work for that 25 minutes, then you take a 5-minute rest, and then you do it again. And again, this is the traditional system, the way that this person created it. And you do that, if you do it up to 4 times, then you want to take a longer break. So it's essentially a system for focusing. And there are many different variations on this system now, but the important aspects are that you have a task identified, that you're in a context where you can work on that task uninterruptedly, and that you actually use the timer. And there are some subtleties here that might not really be apparent. And one of them is there's a reason that the kitchen timer is suggested and that it's a mechanical timer. And that's because if you are using the Pomodoro technique, what you're actually also doing at the same time that you're setting aside some time, which is kind of a, obvious thing to do, is you're also providing cues and triggers to get yourself into a state to get that work done productively. And that's what the mechanical timer does. The fact that it's mechanical is important because the mechanical motions of setting that timer and the ticking of that timer are actually cues that help bring you into a productive state. And they're triggers for being in kind of that productive zone. So it's not as simple as just necessarily marking off the time. It's also thinking about the context around the work that you're doing. And that really is the more, I think, interesting part of this, because Pomodoro is simple, 25 minutes plus 5 minutes, and you might modify that depending on your work practices so that it's 35 and 10 or whatever might fit into the time that you have or the kind of work that you do. That's the simple part. The harder part is then in that time getting things done, and that relies on getting into that zone, or what in psychology is called the flow state. And the flow state has had a lot of research going into it, particularly in the last decade, that supported a lot of what people think just based on their intuition. And the primary person who's been researching this is Mkihail Csíkszentmihályi, and that's how you pronounce the name there. I put it in phonics for you below, if that matters. But Mihai has been studying this for 25 years, and he's kind of documented the characteristics of flow and what allows people to get into the flow state so that they can get the most things done. And all of us have experienced this in different ways. We've all had times where we have been working on something and lost track of time, and we've kind of lost track of ourselves, and we become intensely focused in ways that we really have, very rarely do outside of those very particular instances. The trick with flow and flow states is figuring out how to get into them kind of on command. So there's a lot of research going into this by Mihai, by things like the Flow Genome Project, which talks with artists and actors and athletes and people who routinely find themselves in a state of flow, to figure out how they get there and how other people can make use of that. So the characteristics of flow, according to this theory and the research, is that, one, it's a matter of intense and focused concentration. And here I'm going to read some bullets to you, sorry. That you are merging action and awareness. That's where you lose that track of yourself as part of the activity. So you are just becoming kind of one with what you are doing. And this is most evident with physical activities, but obviously happens with mental activities, intellectual activities, and knowledge work as well. The loss of self-awareness, so that you aren't, kind of present in there. The sense of control that you have. The time distortion is the obvious one. Wow, time flies when you're having fun. We all know this. And then the sense that the activity has an intrinsic reward. So the idea of flow is to bring these characteristics about and figure out the ways to make that happen. The Pomodoro technique, which allows you to focus, is one way to help bring yourself to that state. But setting a timer isn't going to be enough, obviously, to bring you into a flow state, make you feel super productive and happy. If it were, we would just all have timers and be robots and happy robots at So the difficulty with reaching flow is that the context also has to match and create conditions to allow that mental state to happen. And what Mkihail focuses mostly on is this combination of challenge and skill in reaching a flow state. And I'm sorry about the black on dark on this slide, I didn't notice that. But essentially at the lower left, you have low challenges with low skill levels needed, which breeds apathy. And then as you move up the scale to the right quadrant, you will see high challenge activities with a high level of skill needed. And those are this kind of activities that can most readily bring you to a flow state. And I think we all know this. It's pretty hard to remember a time, for me at least, that I've been doing fiscal paperwork and gotten into a flow state. Pretty much I'm aware of what I'm doing all the time, and I dread it, and I have to get it done, and it doesn't matter how I try to focus. But if I'm doing something that's intellectually challenging and that tests what I can do, then I find that I can get into that state much more easily. So on the one hand, with flow and with productivity, what you're trying to do is use this technique with tasks that demand a lot of your skill level, that challenge you but don't feel out of reach. The problem with that, of course, is that we don't all have that kind of work all the time. So one method for increasing productivity is to use something like the Pomodoro technique, which is really a time management technique and a focus model, and then use that with tasks that naturally lend themselves to flow states. So high-level intellectual design work, creative acts, working on challenging crafts and woodworking, painting, expressiveness, whatever. All of those kind of more naturally lend themselves to that state. So if you pay attention to how you pay attention, you will find achieving a flow state much easier. The secret, I think, is to figure out how to do it with those tasks that don't demand such kind of challenge and skill on your part. And this is where we get into recent kind of research into the neuroscience and cognitive states with flow and meditation and activities. And in the last 10 years, because of the kind of evolution in fMRIs and other techniques for imaging the brain in real time, they've been able to do some really interesting research with people in the act of activities where they achieve a state of flow. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing of this image here with those brain scans is the difference in the brain scan of, excuse me, freestyle rappers. So they took these rappers and they used fMRIs and they had them start by doing rehearsed, planned lyrics. And then they had them start improvising. And as they started to improvise, then they would note as they started to feel a sense of flow, they would look back and say, this is the time when I don't even remember what was happening. I was just in the groove. And musicians talk about this a lot, and that what they saw was a really interesting change in the brain functioning where the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of executive decision making and kind of reason tied to action, was active at the same time as other parts of the brain that are more associated with free creativity. And they both operate together and feed one another in a way that doesn't happen very often, because the sense of logic that we associate with decision making was less apparent, and it's basically what we would call creativity. And so it's very interesting to see that, because then on the right you have scans, and all of the links to the research and papers, so you can look at the originals, are on the site for this presentation. That is people who are meditate, and people who are skilled meditators. Would it be called skilled meditators? Yeah, I think so. People who are skilled at meditation, and they achieve the same kind of state through meditation that we associate with the rappers who are freestyling, with athletes who are able to achieve a sense of flow in their activity, with artists, with writers, and that kind of thing. And I think the important connection here, well, there are two things. One, you can't take this at too granular of a level. You have to have some skepticism. Because this is a lot of initial research, and there's still a lot more to be done. But clearly there's something to the fact that the second point, which is we have an immense amount of control over our brain states when it comes to how we associate creative activity and logical decision-making activity. And the way that we can do that are through the skills that are learned with things like meditation. One of the things that has led me to studying this is that I really think productivity and skills like meditation and focus and attention that are trainable but aren't being taught are at a premium in kind of our digitally mediated age. And I think there should be a lot more of it. So I hope this research leads to some ways that we can integrate that into curriculum. But for us as individuals, the question is, how can we use these ideas that we're seeing with people who can achieve a flow state through different activities and can kind of do it on demand by sitting and meditating or sitting and doing that or performing an activity, and how can we bring that to our other work? And that's led to a lot of research into the context around achieving flow that I think are particularly relevant to people who might be watching this presentation. Because if you take the idea of Pomodoro and time management, and you think about the tasks and the time and when you're going to work, and then you consider how you're working on it, the context around which you are working is really important to achieving that state. Because unless you naturally have nothing but super interesting, vital work that's going to naturally lead you to flow, you need some way to help trigger that in yourself. And that's where routines and triggers come in. So there's been a lot of research on this, and I, as my own research experiment, can attest to some of the interesting phenomena around this. So the image I have on the left is Steve Nash, who is the greatest free throw shooter of all time in the NBA. Not because I'm a basketball fan, but because one of the things you'll notice about him and everybody on the list, literally everybody on the list for the top NBA free throw people, is they all have this routine they go through. So Steve Nash does 4 fake free throws, dribbles twice, and then shoots. He has this routine that he uses to lead him to the state where he's no longer thinking about it and he makes that shot. And he's described it, as most athletes do, of being in the zone. And you'll see this. Everybody has these routines as they build up to what they do. And that's one of the things that we can control when we are sitting down to do work to help bring about a flow state, is to think about that context and think about our routines and our triggers. So my particular routine, and one that I know I share with others, because as I've researched this, I found a lot of different kind of testimony as to how this works, involves the place that I'm working, the physical routine to getting there, and earbuds. And I say earbuds, not music, because it turns out the music isn't nearly as important. But my most productive times of the day is 7 to 9 every morning, when I go to the same coffee shop and I sit at the same table and I set up my computer the same way. And I have a playlist that I play and I put in, and immediately when that playlist starts, I know that it's time to get to work. And I don't think of it that way, it's just that's how it happens, because I've created this routine and these triggers for myself. What's interesting about that for me is that not only as I do that, and I typically can do 3 to 4 Pomodoro sessions during that time, and I often lose track of the time, and I really can just kind of sit down and get into that state. What I realized after a while was that I had this music playlist to trigger it, but I would often forget to turn it on. And I would just keep going. And then I realized that really it probably wasn't the music, although I have found that earworm kind of music, the somewhat irritating music that just gets into your head and won't get out, really makes for great trigger music, because it's not something you're going to want to sit and really get into, but it's something that you really have a deep association with in your brain. So for me, my starting song is, I'm afraid to admit this, is a Taylor Swift song, because I find it both so irritating and it's such an earworm, I can't get rid of it. But that works for me. And my playlist is set to be 25 minutes long or pretty close to that, so that when the music stops, I know it's time to take a break. But if I'm just going and I don't even pay attention, I'll find I can go an hour and a half sometimes, and not even realize that the session has ended, because I've created this state that's, and I'm not always doing the most interesting work, but through the routine, that's my kind of free throw routine for sitting down and doing knowledge work, is sitting at the same table, having my drink in the same place, starting that playlist with poor Taylor Swift, and going. And it's really, I think, mostly the physical routines and triggers that have allowed me to do that. And these can work also in negative ways. So you have to be careful that you don't create negative associations between things that you do and your work, which is another aspect to be considered. If you start associating certain activities with negative consequences when it comes to work, those become real disincentives and make it very difficult. So you need to be careful with the context that you're always working in. For instance, for me, it's my office, and being at the office, I have to be careful in how I approach my time there, because I don't want to create a disincentive where I can't get any work done without creating this kind of perfect context for myself. you know, it's a greater version of when I get to the coffee shop and some jerk has sat at my table because they don't recognize that it's mine. And then what do? I can't just decide not to work that day. But this is the part that we can control the context and the triggers around our work to help bring about flow states, regardless of the challenge and the skill level that we might be facing. So that's my idea. Use the collected, whoop, I think I lost a camera. Use the trusted collection system, have some method for keeping track so that you can actually have time to focus, and then work on routines that allow you to achieve flow. And hopefully healthy routines. Drinking, you know, a bunch of whiskey might be helpful for flow in some cases, but probably isn't a sustainable trigger, so you might not want to go that direction. But that's the general idea of what I'm talking about when it comes to the flow state and how to achieve it, and using routines and triggers to get there. So with that, I'm open to questions or comments or whatever people can do from wherever they are right now.
Great, Chris. Thanks for that talk. If you could just turn off your screen share so we can see you as you ask any questions. I guess we'll open it to any of the participants in the Hangout here. Kristen, Heidi, or Owen, do you have any thoughts on this presentation?
I had a couple thoughts. One, in college, I had a routine. I didn't realize I was in it, but I was in the English 271 course, and every night I would, to complete my creative writing assignments, I'd listen to Led Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy on a tape deck with headphones on, and every time I pressed the start button, within about a bar or two, it seemed like 2 seconds later I'd have to flip the tape. And it was 45 minutes on a side, or whatever they were, 120 minutes, 60 minutes on a side, you know, and I would go till 4 in the morning just flipping the tape and never hearing the music and just writing along, and it was kind of that white noise. It achieved that for me really, really effectively.
Yeah, I have an actual association that was negative, and what made me start thinking about that was years ago I had a housemate that I lived with for a couple of years, and every night before he went to sleep he would play this Anya CD. And it reached a point where, like, I hear the beginning of that first song of that CD, and it's like I'm narcoleptic and I want to just pass out because I associate it so much with, like, time to go to sleep now. So yeah, we can create interesting triggers, I think, inadvertently.
The other thing I'll throw out there before people step in is, I think I was listening to you and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the other places in life I've experienced that, and one is hunting. Even 2 years ago, my dad and I went on a five-day fly-in hunting trip for caribou, and it had been years since we'd done that, and for 5 days we had one purpose, and every day was focused on that one thing. From the minute you woke up and even until you were going to bed at night, you were still thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow to achieve that goal. And it was so meditative, those 5 days. We were in a flow state for that whole time. And I came back a completely new, sort of refreshed person. And I think somewhere deep inside of us, that's what we're made to be. We're made to deal in a very sort of intense way with those long wavelength sort of tasks. And sometimes the noise, the high frequency, do this, do this, do this, do this, gets to be very overstimulating. And it's nice to get in that state again where it's just very, the flow state describes it. So anyway, I see there's a question that came in as well.
Yeah. So I'll come back to that too in a second because I have a comment on that. But yeah, so Tim Stickle is asking, how does someone assist a young learner to find their flow state? This is actually what led me to be interested in all of this, was the fact that we don't teach any of these skills. And I think what you teach young learners is the routine, and particularly the ideas of focus and attention. There's a great book called Rapt, R-A-P-T, by Winfred Gallagher, I think, that talks about the trainability of attention. And essentially what you do is, it's kind of the idea of fake it till you make it. So I think with young students especially, but even people who are in high school, what you teach are techniques like Pomodoro. And you give them tasks that are challenging, and you give them a method by which they are actually training their focus. And maybe they start with 15-minute sessions and expand it. There are a lot of ways to approach that. But in having them do that practice, I think they will naturally start falling into flow states, because in that case you can rely on focusing on challenging activities for them. It's much harder with make-work activities to reach flow states, which is why the information about meditation and the effect on the brain that way is interesting to me, because it implies to me that we can control our states in such a way to bring flow about with less challenging activities. But I think for young learners, I would start with the focus on how do you focus and how do you train attention. And I think it's really critical in this day and age, because we have a really hyper-fractured kind of attention economy right now.
Chris, we have another question from Janine McMahon. I'll put that one up for you.
Yeah, so Janine is saying that she's not sure about the 25 plus 5 minutes, but she uses the microwave timer for 10 minutes when it's time to clean, something she doesn't really want to clean, and when the timer dings, at least sometimes she's now in the cleaning mood. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that probably the person who really kind of discovered Pomodoro, it's weird to say somebody discovered a technique, but the technique itself, the book, has a lot more information. But the idea of the work sprint is to get you into the mood even when you're not there, and that's what all of the triggers and routines are about, because I don't think anybody can productively rely on being in the mood to do something, but if you get that kickstart, and 25 minutes might seem like a long time, and it's certainly much longer than 10 minutes, but pretty soon 25 minutes becomes pretty short as you become adept at manipulating that. So yeah, you're manipulating your kind of attitude and mind state and getting into doing the work. It certainly makes sense. And I see a question from Heidi.
Oh, yeah, why don't you go ahead and answer that one?
Oh, okay. So it says, do you use some kind of checklist or spreadsheet to keep track of your progress? Would that be a good way to get started? Yeah, the plus side of, well, the traditional Pomodoro technique uses the timer and a pencil and paper. It's meant to be very low tech. So you're actually keeping track in a de facto way by the checks you make as you do each Pomodoro 25 minutes and you mark it off. Many of the applications have built-in features that keep track. So on the teaching tip, I showed a screenshot of one of the Pomodoro apps that shows you, and so you can say, I want to work on this project, and it keeps track of how many sessions you've had and what you've done. I don't actually pay much attention to that. I pretty much have my checklist, and I just work on it till I'm done, and I haven't really paid attention to that refinement, but I'm not a guru in that sense, so that would be my thought.
I had one question about the basis for the 25-minute time period. Was that an observation of Mihail's, or is that just most people that's a good time to work? And
yeah,
you mentioned like starting off earlier with kids, like giving them 10 minutes and letting them build up.
Right. Yeah. So the Francesco Cirillo, I don't think had any background in cognitive science or anything. He was a student when he made this. So I think he just chose the 25 because it made intuitive sense to him, and because of course the 25 plus 5 fits well into an hour. So I think that had something to do with it. I'm not aware of any research that's gone into what the optimal time period be. There are a lot of variations that use shorter and longer. And certainly I think when working with other people or with kids, a shorter time to start would make good sense to me. And I think in Winifred Gallagher's, I believe that's her name, in the book Wrapped, she does talk about some research into attention, and I believe there's some information in there about shorter time spans as you're trying to get used to it. Because yeah, it's a skill, it's like a physical skill. Our ability to pay attention is very much like a physical skill, and you don't go to the gym and run for an hour, you go to the gym and run for 10 minutes, or in my case 30 seconds, and then hope you can do more the next time, something like that.
Oh, you got about 15 seconds on me then. Kristen has a question.
So yeah, so Kristen is asking about scheduling tools in the beginning, and I think it's important to give yourself permission to focus on something for an extended period of time. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's interesting is there is a school of thought within people who use these kinds of work sprints that says no matter where you're at, you stop and you take that rest period at the end of the defined work time, and I'm not a believer in that at all, which is one of the reasons I've gone with my music playlist as being my timer, because I can just keep on working. So yeah, you need to have the ability to do that. And I don't think you can sit down and do every task in a Pomodoro fashion, do every piece of work in a Pomodoro way. I think it's just a tool to get there. But I do think it's important to schedule time in a larger context so that you don't have to do all the task switching to do this kind of work. So that you might use your calendar to say this 4 hours is for this project, and what you do inside that 4 hours might involve Pomodoro or some other technique or might not. But if you don't do that, that's problematic. Because none of this addresses so far the problem with cognitive load when you switch tasks between creative tasks and other kinds of intellectual work, which is itself adds a bunch of time and overhead. And I see somebody posted that. Thanks, Heidi. It is, yeah, so it's Wrapped, Attention in the Focused Life by Winifred Gallagher. Highly recommend that book.
Well, are there any other questions? I'll just give people...
Yeah, I see one came in from Jennifer about managing interruptions during the work sprints. Yeah, you have to You have to turn it off. You have to turn off your phone. You have to block your door. I mean, that's one of the things. Obviously, in our offices, it's problematic when you don't have an office, especially. But even if you do, with people coming to the door. But a lot of the management interruptions isn't a practical matter. You can turn off your email and turn off your phone and ignore it for 30 minutes at a time. It's training the people around you to respect that, and that's the more difficult behavioral mechanism. But yeah, I think you have to just turn them off. I don't think there's any way to have both your cake and eat it too, to focus in Pomodoro-like, sprint-like fashion and keep checking your email and answering your phone and responding to ad hoc requests.
All right, well, Chris, I'd like to thank you for being the first one for this semester and for all the nice questions we had. On March 25th, our second event will be given by Owen here, who you just saw answer some questions or ask some questions, and he's going to be talking about the Oxford tutorial method in the digital age. And you can find information about that right at the iTeachU website. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks.